Right now, we have the smallest number of veterans in Congress than at any other point in our nation's history. Now, I don't think you need to be a veteran to serve in Congress by any means, but I think when you are a veteran, you bring a unique background, a unique experience, and outlook to Congress. And right now, I don't think Congress has enough vision to really project, as we go into the future, about the things that we need to proactively address the challenges that we face at home and around the globe. We need to obviously confront ISIS, ensure that they are contained and defeated, but then we need to be more proactive. We have emerging threats. We need a comprehensive cybersecurity bill. We're losing tens of billions of dollars of American intellectual property every single day. We're not talking about enough of other emerging threats, such as the Zika virus, which is currently threatening to move north and endanger women and babies and cause significant damage. The president has proposed a $1.9 billion bill to address the Zika virus. Congress has not acted on it. These are the types of unique things that I bring to the forefront and try to get ahead of the curve and actually address these threats before they come to a head.
Could you talk a little bit about the intellectual property that you mentioned in the battle there?
When you talk about the cyber domain, a lot of times we start with national security, which is obviously very, very important. We talk about the hackers that we're seeing. Some of them may or may not be state-sponsored by other nations around the world, but a lot of it is attacks on private companies in the United States. It is going into their mainframes and stealing plans for products and ideas. And that's really what our strength is in the United States, is ideas. Our companies are on the forefront of developing new technologies, processes, et cetera. And what happens is we have foreign competitors who knows exactly how they're doing it or what techniques they're employing, or nation states or unofficially are going in and stealing that intellectual property and are undercutting American companies, which costs us a huge sum at the end of the day.
I mean, is there anything you can do about that in Congress?
Well, we have to have a public-private partnership. There's been a lot of proposals of a comprehensive cybersecurity bill. The private industry is demanding a comprehensive cybersecurity bill. They understand what's at stake. They know that they're losing on this front and that we need to be more proactive about it. But Congress has not taken any significant action on that front.
One of the big issues, of course, that comes up in every congressional election is Social Security and Medicare. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, as I started by saying, I grew up on a family farm here in central Iowa. But when I was 7 years old, my father was killed in a farming accident. And we lost the farm and moved into town where my mother worked for a modest income to take care of my sister and I. But the only thing that really kept my family from falling so far down we couldn't get back up was the basic social safety net, and in particular, Social Security survivor benefits. And that's why my number one priority will always be defending Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, because those are the programs that I believe are the fundamental pieces of our social safety net. And I said this the other night, I know Kathy mentioned that in her coverage, but I believe that Social Security is the most important program that the United States government has ever put into place. It has kept tens of millions of people from falling through the cracks, including me personally and my family.
So how would you ensure its solvency going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we need to lift the cap on contributions. Right now, that's capped at $118,000 a year. The people who benefit the most from the process that we have in place, people who are making millions and billions of dollars a year, should contribute more to ensure that their workers have a secure retirement. I also believe we should implement the Buffett rule, which means that if you make more than $1 million a year in investment income, it should be taxed as income, not as capital gains. And I believe that excess revenue brought in from that should also go into the Social Security Trust Fund.
Will that do it, or will there need to be other changes, whether, that where I would have to, it would affect my benefits, for example?
Yeah. I don't think that's the right approach. I think that'll do it. Obviously, we have to, the CBO has projections as to how much exactly that'll do. We don't know if those projections are correct or not. I think that'll get the job done, at least for the mid to a pretty good long term. But it's always an issue that we have to look at the equation and make sure that it's working and that it's solvent. But there's a lot of scare tactics out there that people use to say Social Security is going to go away. Social Security is not going to go away. The worst case scenario with the Social Security Trust Fund being depleted is that we would still be able to pay out 70% of benefits. And a 30% cut would be awful, and it would be unfair. But Social Security is not going anywhere. But the earlier that we're proactive about addressing these shortfalls, the easier the fix is going to be.
Are you open to looking at, for young people whose life expectancy is to be longer, looking at different ways of adjusting that equation on the benefit side, so when you become eligible for Social Security, et cetera?
No.
Okay.
So you're ruling all of that, when you would rule that out?
Just because someone's life expectancy may be projected to be longer doesn't mean that they don't need to still retire at that same age. If you look at the people who build our country, who break their backs every single day to build our roads and our bridges, put in water lines, etc., by the time they hit 65, they can no longer do that profession because of that's what they've spent their career doing. They're, at that point, the toll has been taken on their bodies. Social Security is a defined benefit that needs to remain in place.
Another scenario, if you were in Congress, how would you handle it if you were asked to vote on let's say a $1.1 trillion spending bill with very little time to read it?
Well, I'm not going to vote on a piece of legislation that we don't have time to review. I mean, so regardless,
Even if your leadership says this has got to be, the pressure.
well, we need members of Congress should not be forced to vote on legislation that we have not had at least some sufficient time to review the details. So I'm not going to vote in favor of anything that I don't know what's in the bill.
So you would just say no on that?
Well, I would say this may be a piece of legislation that I want to support, but I don't know whether I want to support it or not because I haven't reviewed it. And so we have to have sufficient time to review it to know what the details are. But to say I would vote for a piece of legislation that I don't know what's in it would be reckless and not a good thing to do as a representative.
I think the last time you were in, you talked a little bit about immigration and what Congressman King has proposed and how you differ from that. Has your position evolved much on that at all?
No, we absolutely need comprehensive immigration reform. We have 11 million people in this country who are working, who are living, who are sending their kids to school, and we need a fix. We need to find a way to pass comprehensive immigration reform and move towards so those folks can have a legal status. And this stands in stark contrast to, as you said, the party of Donald Trump and David Young and Steve King, who have produced nothing but hateful and divisive rhetoric, and who have said they want to produce a task force to find 11 million people and remove them from our country.
What does comprehensive immigration reform look like for you?
Well, I think it looks, what the Senate had originally passed with overwhelming bipartisan support included a multi-year process for people to come in, apply for a legal status, meet a whole host of criteria that would include paying a fine, learning English, and then they would be able to apply for citizenship.
Are you concerned, though, that that will undermine wages in this country and continue to undermine wages for especially for low-skilled labor jobs?
Well, these people are already working every day, and if you look at who supports comprehensive immigration reform, groups like the Chamber of Commerce, the Farm Bureau, all supported that specific comprehensive immigration reform as well. So I think right now we're in worse shape than we would be in if we could pass that, we'd be in a lot better shape.
Where do you stand on the Waters of the U.S. rule and the EPA and its definition of navigable streams?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think we have to expand the authorities under the Clean Water Act. Obviously, this is something that is being litigated right now. We have to let the judiciary weigh in and say exactly where the line is of the current legislation. But I think we absolutely need to address water quality and expand the authorities that are included in the Clean Water Act. And we also have, sorry, Lynn, but the next Congress will also produce the next 5-year Farm Bill. And when you look at what we can put into the Farm Bill to ensure that the resources are in place, to ensure that farmers have the resources to mitigate runoff, that's something that needs to be included in the next Farm Bill.
Have the resources in terms of public financial support, you
Exactly. The farmers that I know, that I've worked with in the past, absolutely want to do the right thing. They're some of the biggest conservation-minded folks that I know, but they're also running a business. And in many cases, they want to do the right thing, but they have a bottom line, and they don't necessarily have the resources to put some of those mitigation techniques into place. And those are things that should be included in the Farm Bill to ensure that they are able to get those things done.
How do you respond to people who say, I don't want to pay for that? I mean, the farmers created the problem, they should pay for that.
Well, I think that's a very short-sighted view of it. Obviously, we all eat food. That is a fundamental piece of humanity. And so we all need to eat. We all need to support our farmers. That means investing in things. We all need to drink water as well. So we need to have food. We need to have clean drinking water. If we're not willing to invest in those things, then what are we willing to invest in?
Mm-hmm. So is there a stick with that carrot that you're offering?
Well, and there may be, absolutely, but I think we definitely have to produce enough carrots as well. There has to be incentives and assistance to ensure that the overwhelming number of farmers who do want to do the right thing every step of the way have the help to do that.
Taken some flack from some of your opponents for past support of the Keystone Pipeline. Could you just explain your position on that today, and how do you make sure that you aren't jeopardizing water quality, et cetera?
Absolutely. Well, this is a settled issue, as the president said, and when he took action to stop it. I did support it in 2014, based primarily on what the State Department concluded in their environmental impact study. But this is an overinflated issue that both sides, I think, inflated to the point of just being out of proportion. And that's exactly what the president said when he weighed in on it.
You say it's a settled issue, but here in Iowa, the Bakken pipeline issue is going to be going on for a long time. I mean, are there things that you think ought to be considered here, or are people just overreacting?
Well, there are absolutely things we have to consider, which is why we had that environmental impact study by the State Department, why you have the Army Corps of Engineers weighing in on impacts that it might have on water tables. So we have a process in place. Our number one priority needs to be investing in clean, renewable energy as we move forward. Here in Iowa, we have the most to gain by being proactive, and we have the most to lose by not acting via the impacts that it will have on our agricultural economy. But we are on the forefront here in Iowa. Obviously, over 30% of our electricity comes from wind. We're seeing huge investments as we move forward into the future. The $3.5 billion that Mid-American announced to continue to grow our wind capacity, and that's the right approach. So as we deal with short and midterm issues with ensuring we have enough energy, we always need to keep our eye on what the ultimate prize is, which is clean, renewable American energy, which is an economic security and a national security issue.
And you don't think the building pipelines detracts from that goal of moving forward to invest in clean, renewable energy?
Well, as I said, I think obviously we have short-term energy needs, but we always should be looking at whether we should be investing in some short-term energy needs when ultimately the top priority should be investing in long-term projects that are clean and renewable.
You're a supporter of the RFS, correct?
I am.
And what was your reaction to EPA's announcement yesterday on the new levels?
I hadn't seen that.
Okay. So where do you think they should be, I guess, is
I'm in favor of maintaining the current RFS levels.
that Congress set, because the EPA each year, that's what they're doing, changing those levels a little
Right.
bit, and some things say that.
I'm in favor of maintaining it at the highest level that we had previously set. I think that it's, again, it's an opportunity to have domestic clean energy that's produced right here in Iowa, and it's important to our economic security in Iowa and our nation, and to our national security. I've spent a lot of time in the Middle East. I've seen, kind of the wars that have been fought over energy, and the Pentagon says in their national security strategy that climate change and energy scarcity and water scarcity are going to be one of the top drivers of conflict as we move into the future. So ensuring that we have clean, renewable American energy will help America navigate the kind of global issues that we'll see related to those complex shortages that we may see in the future.
Okay.
On the issue of the minimum wage, we're starting to see changes made at the county level in Iowa and in other states. Well, what needs to be done at the federal level?
Well, we have to establish a minimum federal wage, and obviously, when you look at state and local minimum wages, that's great that we have that in our federalism, where a minimum wage in rural Iowa may not be the same as a minimum wage needs to be in Des Moines or New York City or elsewhere. So what the objective of the federal minimum wage is that every single worker in all 50 states at that minimal level is able to take care of themselves and their family. I believe there's dignity in work, and if you work 40 hours a week in this country, you should be able to take care of yourself and your family. And right now, that's just not the case.
So what level are you?
I think we need to have a livable wage, and so I think we need an immediate increase in the minimum wage. Obviously, I'm pragmatic about what we can actually get passed. I can say what I'm in favor of, but if we don't have the votes to do that, then it's not going to get done. So I think we need to increase the minimum wage immediately, and then peg it to inflation to ensure that livable wage continues to progress at that level. So no matter what we see in the future for price levels, if you work full-time, you can take care of yourself and your family.
In terms of what you'd like to see, there's been talk about $15.
Absolutely.
Would you support that if it was?
Well, I think that is in the range of what a livable wage needs to be. Now, I don't think that going to that level overnight, I think would be a pretty dramatic increase that might shock the economic equilibrium a little too much. But we definitely need to get to that level over a period of years.
Okay.
What about, what is your answer? Stagnant wages overall, not just minimum wage?
Absolutely. Well, we're seeing more jobs. The unemployment rate here in Iowa nationally is much lower, but they're not good jobs. As I said, we need to ensure that working families continue to be able to take care of themselves and have a brighter future. So my campaign and what I talk about are focused on those kitchen table issues that families like mine face, which are investing in our infrastructure, which does create good paying American jobs that can't be outsourced. I'm a strong supporter of investing in our roads and our bridges, and unfortunately right now, David Young was one of only 64 members of Congress to vote against the bipartisan highway bill. He was the only member of the Iowa delegation to do so. Even Steve King and Rod Blum voted for that highway bill because they even understood that investing in our infrastructure is the right approach as we move forward into the future.
Do you agree with the Obama administration's move to require overtime pay for essentially salaried employees making over, was it $48,000 or under $48,000?
Under 48,000, yeah. I do agree with that because, again, when you look at the breakdown of hourly wages, people who were maybe working 70 or 80 hours a week as a salaried employee are making very, very low wages, and that's essentially a labor abuse.
So there's been a lot of talk about in this cycle about a general public frustration with politics as usual, and the partisanship that's happening in Washington. Mm-hmm. What would you say to voters in terms of the way that you would handle combating some of the gridlock and partisanship that's happening?
Well, as I've said, my entire career has been about service, not politics, and that's what my record shows. When the greatest generation came home from, war, we had one of the highest percentage of veterans in Congress, people who had put service first. And it didn't matter whether you were Democrat or Republican, making sure that our country's future was better was their top priority. And they were pragmatic in accomplishing that, and they invested in our future. That's what we need a lot more of. Now, when David Young came before this editorial board in 2014, he said that he was a moderate, he was a pragmatic, that he had spent his last 30 years in Washington, and he knew how Washington worked, and he would govern in a moderate way. But from day one, that has been proven incorrect. He's voted 7 times to repeal the Affordable Care Act. He's voted 6 times to defund Planned Parenthood. He's voted twice against the Equal Pay Act. He voted against the highway bill, as I stated. He's voted to privatize Medicare. He's voted time and time again. When he's had a chance to vote for bipartisanship and moderation, he's voted with the Tea Party. He's voted with David Young. Of course he's voted with David Young. But he is really reflecting the party of Donald Trump. And that's exactly why he said that the things that Donald Trump is saying is what people are thinking, and he supports him as the Republican nominee. And that's why I think David Young really needs to answer if he supports Donald Trump's agenda in saying that women who have abortions should be punished, in saying that we need to develop and fund a task force to remove 11 million people from our country. That's really the contrast that's at stake here. I am someone who has a background in finding bipartisan consensus, in saving taxpayer dollars. That's what I bring to the table, and that's how I'll work in Congress.
Talk a little bit about trade policy. You talk about your farm background. The TPP is very important to the agriculture industry here, but a lot of workers and unions are very concerned about it. So how do you approach TPP and trade policy overall?
Absolutely. Well, every trade deal has pros and cons to it. I think we all understand that. As I've reviewed the proposed Trans-Pacific Partnership, I have concluded that the cons do outweigh the pros, and I oppose the Trans-Pacific Partnership. When you look at what it will do, it does not have labor protections in place, it does not have environmental protections in place, it will continue to undercut American workers and ship jobs overseas for a short-term payoff. That's not the equation that we need.
How do you react?
Go ahead.
How do you react to folks who say that either we make this deal now or we're ceding, political and economic power in the region by China coming in and putting in place their own policies and plans?
Well, I think everyone understands that we have a significant relationship around the world currently with China and other Asian countries, and ceding American jobs overseas is not a better approach than having that trade deal in place.
You mentioned the Affordable Care Act and David Young's votes to repeal that. Are there specific revisions or tweaks to the program that you'd be in favor of?
Absolutely. The Affordable Care Act did a lot of very important things, ensuring that women can't be discriminated against for being a woman as a pre-existing condition. It means that people like my youngest son, who have a rare neurodegenerative disease, can't be discriminated against. When you have a condition like that, it's never going to be profitable for an insurance company to insure you. But the alternative is bankruptcy. That's not the right approach. 2015 was the first year that over 90% of Americans had health insurance. We're moving in the right direction, but we've got a lot more work to continue to do. I think we need to eliminate the Cadillac tax, which essentially taxes insurance benefits that are deemed to be too generous. And I think when you look at, based on my conversation with a lot of physicians, the relicensing process that was put into place under the ACA seems to be a little clumsy and overburdensome for doctors. And I think we need to relook that and create a little less burden on physicians during those relicensing periods.
What about, excuse me, a lot of companies dropping out of the exchanges. So how do you, what's your answer for that?
Well, we also have companies coming into the exchanges, and like Wellmark here in Des Moines coming into the Iowa exchange. But when you look at the initial implementation of the Affordable Care Act, it was a little bit rocky at times, and that's always the case with large implementations of new policies. But it's also because Republicans were actively working every single day to undermine the implementation, including leading a government shutdown over defunding it. So it's very, very difficult to implement a policy when you have a huge number of legislators and state level folks who are actively working to undermine it and ensure that it fails. So in that respect, I think we've actually done very well, considering we have people who are actively sabotaging it.
You mentioned that one of the things that sets you apart is your experience in working within the federal government for years. I assume that's given you a front row seat to some of the negative aspects of a large bureaucracy and that kind of thing. Are there specific things that you'd like to see changed or revised that would make the federal government more efficient?
Well, I would like to implement the same reforms that I put into place at the Pentagon across the bureaucracy of the federal government, which is updating and improving our acquisition processes, our IT, our logistics, and also insourcing. We've seen a huge outsourcing initiative under the Bush administration. A lot of those are still in place. There are inherently governmental work being done by private contractors, private companies who have a profit motive, we can see that job being done better and at a lower cost if we insource those things.
Are there specific examples of that come to mind?
Well, you
these
know,
inherently government
sure.
responsibilities.
Well, specifically, when I was at the Pentagon, one thing that had been outsourced was security at the gates at forts. And so we had armed security guards who had the authority to use lethal force to defend that gate, who were not public employees. They were private employees.
And this was where again?
This was across Army installations across the country. We had private security contractors who had the authority to use lethal force against potential threats coming at that. And they were not a public employee, they were a private employee.
It seems like that's sort of counterintuitive, that these are military.
It is counterintuitive, exactly, and that's
it.
it. Well, it was to free up other people, other military folks to go do different jobs. But to have the idea that the government is paying a private employee to potentially use lethal force against American citizens, I thought was wrong. That's why we worked in that practice. It is inherently, things like national security are inherently governmental work that should not be handled by private companies. That's why I'm against privatization every step of the way. The government exists for a reason. The private sector exists for a reason. They each have their roles and responsibilities and the things that they should be responsible for. The federal government, the state government should not be contracting out things that should be done by public servants. Now, there are certain things, obviously, you can get into the weeds of, somebody mowing the grass at a government building. That may be something that you contract out to a private company to do. But handling, security, personal privacy issues, those should be done by public employees.
How did you find, I assume that's an example where it wasn't an efficiency. It's going to cost the taxpayer more to have public employees do that. So is that right?
What you would see is there was an initial cost to it, but over time, when you eliminate the need to have a profit margin for a private company, you see long-term savings. And that's, I think, the fundamental difference and disagreement that I have a lot of times with Republican lawmakers is they're not willing to make the upfront investment on these things. They see a cost savings immediately, but if you invest in some things, that's the definition of his investment, is you have to invest up front to reap the rewards as we move forward. And so insourcing those positions may have an initial cost, but over a period of time, you'll see savings associated with that.
Mm-hmm. So what was it, like a specific, you cite, I believe on your website, I don't recall the number that you helped, this office helped the Pentagon save, however much money.
$3.5 billion.
$3.5 billion.
And that's
So for like that, what was an example where you played a role in finding savings like that?
Well, a lot of it was within our IT infrastructure. The way IT had been built up in the private sector and in government had been over a period of time where people didn't have, an enterprise strategy from day one, a big, large, comprehensive way in which we were going to handle our data centers, data exchange, et cetera. And so over the years, all those things, and I know I'm getting into the weeds here, but all of those things, had kind of been cobbled together, and piecemeal patches had been put into place where we were paying for a bunch of different systems to talk to one another, when in fact what we needed to do was simply upgrade those things, consolidate data centers, et cetera. And when we did that, and they did require an upfront investment, we saw huge cost savings. But that's why, again, you have to look at these things in a comprehensive way. And you have to look at them over the mid and long term, not just what's going on today. And this applies to so many different policies that we face as a nation. As I stated, when I brought up the Zika virus, this isn't something that people are talking a lot about right now. We need to talk about it right now because I guarantee you, as we move forward, this is going to become a bigger and bigger issue. And the fact that Congress has not appropriated funds now to get ahead of this shows how irresponsible we're being. And that's exactly why we've been put in the position in so many ways across the spectrum, because we haven't put up the upfront investment and the work ahead of time, and then we wonder why it's a bigger issue down the road.
So when you've been back to Iowa from Washington since 20...
Well, I lived in Northern Virginia when I was at the Pentagon. The only time I've lived outside of Iowa have been when I was in Iraq with the Iowa Army National Guard or when I was working at the Pentagon.
Okay.
So I was deployed from 2005 to 2007 to Iraq. I returned to Iraq in 2009. I went to the Pentagon in 2010 to 2013.
So you've been back here for about 3 years. And
Yeah.
okay.
Well, I was gone for
and you've been
three
you
and a
had a
half years.
chair position at the party. What else have you been doing?
Well,
I know you ran for Congress.
That's
too.
right. That's right. Exactly. Well, I've done some consulting and some other work as well, but I've been primarily focused on service and ensuring that we have a stronger party and running for Congress.
As part of this year's presidential campaign, there's been a lot of talk about student debt, and of course there have been specific proposals about free college and that sort of thing. What do you think the federal government should do on this?
Well, I support the president's free community college initiative. I was lucky enough to go to college on the GI Bill. I think that that's a very important program. I did work on the post 9/11 GI Bill. I was very disturbed that David Young co-sponsored legislation a few weeks ago to cut the GI Bill for veterans' families. I think that's, time and time again we see political leaders say that they support veterans and then their actions go in the other direction. And so I've been very disappointed to see that, and I don't think that there's been enough said on that topic. I think when you look at the student loan debt crisis, my wife Chelsea has several student loans still. I support Senator Warren's bill that allows folks with student loan debt to consolidate that, lower the interest rate so that you have one payment, and it's an income-based repayment as well. I also think we should have a public service option. Military service was the right answer for me. It's not the right answer for everybody. As I stated earlier, one of the reasons I think that the Greatest Generation was known as the Greatest Generation is because everyone had been part of a collective effort for our nation. And if we have more people who spend a year or two working in AmeriCorps or working in other public service areas, pre-college or post-college, as a way to defray some of the costs, we're going to have citizens who have personally invested in our nation. And that means as we move into the future, we're going to have people who are a lot more concerned about the direction that we're headed.
So are you saying that expanding AmeriCorps or
I think there's a whole
benefits?
host of opportunities. I think it's a combination of benefits and what those opportunities specifically are. Because there are some, if it's a post-college opportunity, for example, you may have someone who comes out of college with an engineering degree, and there are unique things that they can do to serve their country. And I think we just have to find those opportunities and put them in the right place to be helpful and productive.
Some people have actually proposed mandatory public service for people graduating from high school.
Yeah. I don't support mandatory public service. I think people should still maintain the ability to decide the path that they want to take, but that there should be good options in place for you to consider.
Would you add women to selective service? Make them
Yeah.
eligible for the draft?
Well, we all saw that what Republican congressmen did was add that in the House Armed Services Committee, and when it came to a vote, it actually passed. That was not his intention. What I've heard and from the budget projections that would actually provide a cost savings. I think that it's something that I don't think has been fully fleshed out in the public debate. I think it's something, when I was at the Pentagon, I did work to open all military occupational specialties open to women, especially in combat roles. I think it's something that I'm very open to, but I want to have that full debate and get feedback and really consider what all the implications of that are. But it is something that I think I would likely support. But I want to see a little bit more and hear a little more debate on it first.
What about just the role of women generally in combat?
Yeah.
Do you think that there is a role? Should that role be limited? And also, I wanted to get what you think of the Joni Ernst-Claire McCaskill bill on military sexual assault.
Yeah. So I think that, first of all, women have been in combat. Now, they haven't been in specific units and military occupations like infantry. We're moving to implement that. I think that all roles should be open to female service members. Obviously, they have to meet the same guidelines, the same standards as male soldiers. I served in an infantry unit, which was at the time all male. but at the same time we had female service members who were side by side with us, but they were working in another unit, but they were in the same place, facing the same risks and dangers that we were. So we're moving in the right direction on that front. On the that specific piece of legislation with Senator Erst and Senator McCaskill, I do support that. That is something that we did look at in the Pentagon. There are a lot of folks within the military chain of command who would rather not remove that that UCMJ action from the chain of command. But from my perspective, when you look at so many of the cases where we have sexual misconduct, that in some way, shape, or form, that military chain of command, the personal relationships that exist within the military service, somewhat remove ensuring that we have people who are completely open-minded, don't have any bias or anything like that. So I think we do need to have reforms on that front, and that's something that I know that there's a lot of folks in the Pentagon disagree with.
Is the defense budget right now, do you feel it's adequate, or what do you think is the...
Well, I think our priorities are out of whack. I think when you look at where we're investing our funds, we are too aligned to still combat the Cold War. We're funding programs within the Pentagon and parochial interests that are not needed by warfighters of today or warfighters in the future in the evolving threats that we face. So it's a priorities issue. The problem is, for one example, the generals have said time and time again, we do not need the Abrams tank. It's outdated. We don't want any more of them. Congress continues to shove this tank down the Pentagon's throat because of the parochial special interest that the defense contractors have created. And so it's a priorities issue, and it's about where we're investing to ensure that our current warfighters have what they need and that we're continuing to invest in the future threats that we're going to face.
Mm-hmm. That's one example, but I mean, what other ways would you realign the funding to meet different priorities?
Well, I think we're seeing a large emergence in the space domain and the cyber domain, and we're seeing a lot of asymmetric warfare threats. We're seeing less and less of our normal force-on-force kinetic warfare that you would imagine between two legitimate nation states. Obviously, we do need to be prepared to fight those wars in the future, but in the scheme of what our likely threats will be, that has become significantly lessened. And so I think we have to appropriately align our resources for the emerging threats.
You mentioned climate change earlier. Are there specific actions that Congress should take to address the threat of global warming that you'd like to see them tackle?
Absolutely. The science is in. Climate change is real. Anyone who says otherwise is putting their head in the sand. As I stated earlier, here in Iowa specifically with our agricultural economy, there's a lot at stake. We need to be more progressive in what we're doing on this front. It's an existential threat to our entire globe, to our nation. It is a national security threat that the Pentagon has been sounding the alarm on for years. We need to move towards clean renewable energy and curb our carbon emissions significantly, and I support the President's Clean Power Plan to do that.
The president was too slow to get involved militarily in Syria.
We're talking about a very complex environment and essentially a five-sided conflict between the Assad regime, anti-Assad forces that are aligned somewhat with the United States and our other world allies. We're seeing ISIS, who is aligned against us, the Kurds, the Peshmerga, the PKK. What we're seeing as it bleeds over into Iraq. This is a very complex fight. And so trying to weigh in on exactly what the best use of American power is very, very difficult. For example, recently there was a battle between the Assad regime and ISIS forces. We believe in removal of the Assad regime, and we believe in destroying ISIS. So in that particular case, what is the role of the United States in that battle? When we've got bad guys fighting bad guys, so to speak, what is the role of the United States? So I think it's been...
Well, the U.S. had to decide to get involved in the first place, and now that we're over there, we have to decide what to do. But, would you have sent us there in the first place?
Are we talking about in what year are we referring to? 2014,
Well,
2013?
maybe the first, when the line in the sand was drawn and violated.
That Assad must go?
Yeah.
In 2013, look, I think that putting a large number of American service members on the ground with brigade combat teams, et cetera, has been proven not to be the right approach. And I think it would complicate the situation, would actually move us backwards, not forward. I think right now, the way that we're fighting it with working with our allies around the globe, working with our Arab allies in the region, supporting the Iraqi security forces, by having a small number of enablers on the ground as forwards, spotters, et cetera, who can help call in airstrikes, that's the right approach.
A Senate candidate was in here the other day and said that the U.S. and Russia basically have a conspiracy to prop up Assad for a short period of time while he's useful. Do you think that that's true?
I would not say it that way, no.
Okay.
What way would you say it?
Well, again, because of the complexity of the situation, we have not taken aggressive actions to completely remove the Assad regime, and that is primarily because of the complexity that exists. When you have Assad fighting ISIS, et cetera, you have the Kurd, the Sunni, the Shia divide, everything that we're seeing there. I think that not taking that aggressive action in the short term is probably the right approach. And so I guess I would not articulate that in the same way, but maybe that's what they were trying to get at. I don't think that's accurate, though.
One of your opponents says that the way to fix rural Iowa is to have broadband expansion so that people can have jobs in Des Moines and Kansas City, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
Do you agree with that approach? Do you think that that is would in fact be enough to save rural Iowa?
Well, I've been talking about this for years. If you look back on my statements from 3 or 4 years ago, these are the things that I've been talking about as investment in rural America and rural Iowa specifically. We're seeing a lot of people move to large urban areas. I think in the coming years, decades, we're going to see a reversal. We're going to see people moving away from what, in some cases is urban sprawl, moving out to lower cost of living areas where they have access to quality education, to not, having the same kind of issues with commutes, et cetera, that they see in these large urban areas. But in order for that to happen, there has to be investment. That does include broadband internet. It includes investment in education, investment in roads and bridges and other infrastructure to ensure that that's the case. More and more, we are seeing jobs that can be done remotely. They can be done from anywhere with a computer, with a phone. Of course, the phone can go through the computer, but the technology has to be in place and the data in place in order for that to happen. But I think you're going to see companies in large cities who are going to start to outsource that work, so to speak, although it's going to be outsourced within the United States to other Americans, to where someone sitting in rural Iowa can be working for a company that's based in New York City. And that's going to be a good thing for that company because they're not going to have to pay someone to live in New York City, which of course has a very, very high cost of living.
You mentioned reprioritizing defense spending. In terms of homeland security, are you comfortable with the priorities that the federal government has now?
Well, our priority, number one, is always keeping the American homeland safe. And so I think, again, when you look at exactly where that funding is put, we're not putting enough in screening cargo containers as they're coming in, et cetera. But we've seen a lot of privatization on that front as well, is privatizing some of those securities contracts, and I don't think that's the right approach.
Talking more about the privatizing security, there's been several airports that have threatened to privatize their airport security because TSA can't keep up.
Mm-hmm.
Is that an area you would support, or how would you address that issue?
Well, the whole point about privatization is it's supposed to be a short-term fix when we have a gap. Now, I don't think in the long-term privatization of things like airport security is the right approach. I think that we should have people, public servants, in those positions. Now, if you have a case like we're seeing right now, if you have a short-term gap that needs to be filled before you can implement a real solution, that's something that I'm open to, but it's not the real solution. It's a stopgap measure.
So you see all privatization efforts as short-term fixes to a longer?
Not all privatization. Any privatization of something that should be inherently governmental. I don't want an employee of a private company to be authorized to pat me down at an airport. I want a public employee, a public servant in that position.
Is that because of not just cost, but accountability?
Yes,
That's-
absolutely. I mean, I know it seems like a strange line to draw, but if, for example, when we had the privatization of security guards, if someone is going to use lethal force, it should be a sworn law enforcement officer, public servant, not a private security guard. Now, I don't want to be shot either way by him, but I believe that judgment should be made by someone who is accountable as a public servant.
So, let's say you win. What is
Yeah,
what is
I like
the
that.
what is the first what are your first orders of business
Yeah.
as you get sworn into office?
Well, obviously a lot of it's going to depend on what the composition of Congress is, who holds the White House, et cetera. I think there's a couple things that we can do immediately that will have a major impact on the American people and what we're doing. Number one is raising the minimum wage, giving workers an immediate pay raise, increasing that amount of consumer spending, et cetera, is going to be a very, very good thing that's going to have an immediate effect, that's going to affect real people's lives, and it's something that we can do. I think even with somewhat of a divided Congress, I think that there's enough votes from some moderate Republicans who think we do need to raise the minimum wage. It may not be as much as we want it to be, but I think we can see some movement on that front. And I think we need an investment in infrastructure. I've seen a lot of support from the private sector, from some more traditionally Republican-aligned organizations who think that we do need an increased investment in our infrastructure, and I think that's something that we could get done in short order in a new Congress.
What we turn to for mentors, both for this
Yeah.
run and just preparing for public service.
Absolutely. I had the great opportunity to work for Joe Biden when he was a senator. He's someone who I still speak with regularly, who offers obviously a great deal of experience and advice. Another person who encouraged me to run is Senator Harkin, our longtime Democratic senator here in Iowa. Shortly after the last election, he called me and said, "You're the right guy. You need to run again." Now, he wasn't specific about when or where or what he thought the right approach was, but he told me I absolutely should run again. He said, I didn't win the first time I ran for Congress. I won the second time I ran. You need to run again. You're doing the right things. Your heart's in the right place. Your priorities are correct. And so Senator Harkin is someone that I speak to regularly. He called me from California last Friday just to get an update on how things are going. And, I think that's a pretty good person to be getting guidance from. Tom Harkin accomplished a great deal in his career. If I can accomplish just a small percentage of that, I will be very, very satisfied. And that's really what it's all about. Obviously, you have to win the election to get something done, but we should be judged by results, not just by showing up, not just by traveling around and talking to folks and saying we want to get things done. We should be judged by what we actually accomplish. And I think there's too many members of Congress who've forgotten that is the objective. They say, well, I've rearranged the deck chairs. I've went to the yellow ribbon cutting ceremony. I visit, all 16 counties once a month. That's not what your job in Congress to do is. Your job is to deliver for your constituents, and I don't think we're seeing enough of that.
Because a lot of people in Congress say that, the day they take office, from that point forward, most of their job entails campaign donations and getting support for their next run for office. So I realize you can't change the dynamic of all of that, but are there specific things in terms of campaign finance reform
Yes.
that you'd be supportive of?
We absolutely need campaign finance reform. There are two things right now that are fundamentally flawed in our democracy. Number one is the gerrymandering of congressional districts. Luckily enough, we don't have that in Iowa, but you see that around the country. And number two is campaign finance reform. How and who our campaigns are financed is completely broken. And that's just talking about actual campaign donations, let alone post-Citizens United, where you can have all these dark money groups come in. No one knows where the money's coming from. It's unlimited. I don't think that any of our founding fathers would look at that and say, yep, that's the democracy that we had in mind. Our democracy is broken and we need to fix it as soon as possible. And that's part of the reason we can't get to these other issues, is because we have a fundamental flaw in how our representatives are elected.
What'd you learn from your last run?
Well, you obviously, and that's part of the reason, when Senator Harkin said, he said that, you're always better your second time around because you've experienced it. I'm a lot more confident, I know when I come into rooms like this exactly what I want to say, exactly how I want to go about it. But I think the most important piece that I learned was to always talk about exactly what your priorities are. In politics at time, everybody sometimes says, oh, we should hedge, we should try to talk about these other things, we don't want to talk about this. We need to, every single time you have the opportunity to talk to folks, you need to talk about what your priorities are, what you stand for, and frankly, that's for an entire party as well, not for an individual candidate or an individual campaign. That's what you need to be focused on. That's how you get your message across to voters, and they then understand the choice that really exists.
We're about out of time. Is there anything else that you were anticipating us to ask?
Well, I just want to talk a little bit more about what my priorities, and my priorities are based on my personal experience and what I've had to deal with and what I think really affect other families across Iowa and across our country. As I said, I grew up, having a mother who was struggling to take care of my sister and I. What bothers me to no end is that knowing that she made 77 cents as a female worker for every dollar that a male worker makes is outrageous. And it's wrong, and it needs to change, and the fact that we're still having this debate is ridiculous. And it would have made our lives a heck of a lot easier if we had equal pay for equal work. As a veteran, I think we need to do a lot better job of taking care of our veterans. I've seen firsthand the sacrifice of our service members, the fact that we're still not fully funding the VA, the fact that we're trying to cut veterans benefits, as David Young does, is ridiculous and it's wrong. And third, being the father of a son who faces very, very serious medical problems and concerns, the fact that we have decreased the amount of funding in real dollars to the National Institute of Health is outrageous. We are on the brink of breakthroughs on research into diseases like my son's, on cancer, on Alzheimer's, and that is a fundamental role of government, is to invest in research on those fronts where the profit motive does not exist for the private sector, private pharmaceutical companies, et cetera. We need to continue to invest. That's something that impacts every single family across our state and across our country.